Welcome to our community. Susie Thomas with you this morning. We are so happy to welcome Rex Beach to the studios. Good morning.
Good morning.
Very interesting news story about you recently. I would say many, have heard your name and have been reading about it, but I'm going to let you tell it, Rex. And as a lot of people are so interested in Ancestry.com now and getting to know a little bit more about their roots, you recently had an interesting experience. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, in June of 2009, I was going through a divorce, and I decided then I had a lot of free time on my hands, so I thought it would be a good time to try to find my father. And I'd heard stories about how people found lost relatives and relatives they never heard of, and through Ancestry, so I joined that and started searching. Mm-hmm. And the nice thing about it is that they connect you with all the different other members all over the world who are also looking for the same family members, like all the Beaches or the Cubbies or whoever. And then when they have, other members have clues, pictures, and things that you don't have, and it gives them as hints on your website that you're on. So that's how I started getting clues about my father and about my mother.
What did you have to go on to begin with?
Well, basically, not too much. My mother was and all of her family, very secretive about my father and everything about his relatives, even though my father and all of his side of the relatives all lived in Lima, Ohio, which wasn't that far away from where we grew up in southern Ohio. But all my mother would ever say was that they met after World War II, and he was served in World War II, and that's pretty much all she would ever say.
And that was it. So, so you were able to take that, and that's just not a lot to start with. So how did you go about finding what you needed to find?
It started by putting in my father's name, and then there's other clues that helped from other members of the family, Beaches, who were looking that had other information. So that's how I learned he was born in Lima, Ohio, and I found out who his father was. And then I traveled up there to Lima, Ohio to visit what was be my grandfather's grave up there. And then I found news articles, because you can get news articles from the past. And I started learning more and more about my father and his father, and how ironically that this is about almost 100 years ago, that when my father was 3.5 years old, his parents had a very bad divorce, and it was in the front page of the Lima News, and his dad and mom separated, and his dad left him.
So you were starting to relate to him a little bit on more and more level. You've made lots of discoveries by going through this.
Yes.
Tell us some of the most amazing discoveries to you, and then I'd like to get into what is it about this that just absolutely grips us, and we have this insatiable need to know where do we come from, who are we? Tell us a little bit about what else you've discovered.
Well, my mother had always mentioned how that my father was from like English descent, and not much else than that. I know my mother's side was Cubby, so they were Irish and things like that, but I've always wondered, I guess like any child in my situation growing up, you always wonder why they leave. And like I told TV news reporters, that one of the things that helped me get through my childhood, which was not very pleasant, and was the fact that I had one old, very small photograph of my father and me when I was a little toddler, and it shows him trying to help me stand on my feet and learn how to walk, and it showed him smiling, and so I always knew that showed that he loved me. He didn't leave me because, some fathers leave because they don't want kids, or, they didn't want the child and things like that, And I always held on to that because most of the time I lived growing up literally home alone, because my mom always worked 3 to 11 as a nurse. And obviously if you're going to school and you get off at 3, it's sort of,
Right.
You got a lot of time alone.
Wow. Yes, you did. But how nice that you would have that the picture you had of your father was of him smiling at you. That makes a difference, doesn't it?
Yes.
You took that information, and it's become quite a story. First of all, why do you think? What do you think has resonated with people so much about this, Rex?
I think one of the most interesting things that people have asked me about is, why did you go through all that you've gone through? And it's just finding him took a little over a year and a half. And then once I found him, then finding out what happened to him after he passed away and all, and how his body was treated, and then the journey, quest, whatever you want to call it, of proving my father served in World War II, and trying to get his body exhumed and brought up here like it happened. You know, it took 8 years, and friends have asked me, well, why did you work so hard? Why did you struggle so hard to do this for somebody who all my life had been told, deserted me and left me, never came back, never tried. And I guess basically I was just doing it because of love. I mean, a child always loves their parents, and I explained in my eulogy I had at my father's funeral that the fifth commandment of God doesn't have an escape clause. It doesn't say, honor thy father and mother only if they're loving, caring family.
If they deserve it.
Yeah, they deserve it, There's no exceptions, And
But a lot of people, Rex, would have given you a pass on that. To be told from childhood that you'd been basically deserted, and that you found out kind of differently, didn't you? That you found out differently. What did you find out? What did you learn about your father?
It wasn't until after the newspaper reporters had asked me the basic information that I had always been taught, and I started after around the holidays last month thinking about all this, and I remembered then memories from my childhood. My mother had told me that as I was a little baby, and after they had separated, we lived in little towns in southern Ohio. We'd moved from one little town to another little town, and then until I got to where I went to school age, we moved into Wheeling, West Virginia, and that's where I grew up. But I started to look into my father's work history more closely, and that's one of the things that surprised the reporters that I didn't know. It took me 6-7 months to be able to get that last year, just to get his work history. And it turned out that he had worked 86 jobs in 16 different states from coast to coast.
Wow.
At the beginning, I was based on my assumption he was, he ran away from me, so he's probably one of these guys that wandered from town to town,
Couldn't commit.
Yeah, and just never could commit. But then when I looked at his work history a few weeks ago, I realized my mother's version didn't match, because we grew up, or I was born in Dayton, Ohio, and so if my father ran away from us, then it would be logical to assume he would not live in the same town. But his work history showed that he worked in Dayton, Ohio until I was in 6th grade. Or not 6th grade, but 6 years old.
Wow.
And so I began to, all the pieces of the puzzle seemed to make sense more, that explains why all my life for 60 years, all of her family, including my mother, literally went to the grave, never telling me anything about my father. And when my mother passed away in 2006, I asked her sister, which was my aunt, well, maybe now you can tell me, what happened to him. I mean, did he drink? There's got to be some reason why did they split up. And she just said it was a sad situation. That's all I can say.
Oh, my.
And so I began to realize things, and I can't prove it. And I guess after all this time, it doesn't really matter. But I began to wonder if maybe the truth was that my mother and father obviously had problems, and like a lot of families do, and you separate, or you do divorce. But maybe in my case, I was actually kidnapped by my mother. That would explain why she moved from town to town back in the early days of my childhood, why all of her relatives would never say anything about my father or his relatives, just a total secrecy, because back then it was a very big thing about shame. Now it's like you just put it in the newspapers and you brag about it, you know.
That's quite a discovery for someone to find out and think, oh my gosh, my whole life I thought he ran, but we were on the lam instead. How did you handle that?
Yeah, it was a little. I mean, I can understand then why my other relatives would be not wanting to tell me the story even as an
Right.
adult, because they figured your natural reaction would be you would hate your mother, the one that did this, and it's kind of makes more sense than maybe the truth was that he didn't wander from town to town or state to state, but he actually was maybe trying to find me, thinking if I
Yes.
moved to this place, because back then, in my days, there was no internet, no computers, there was no TV talk shows that look for missing people or nothing. So you just had to go, literally from town to town. But I have,
But that realization that your father was no doubt trying to find you, that had to completely change your whole world, your whole
Yeah.
your whole history, self-history
Yeah.
of life as you knew it. How does a person begin to reconcile something like that without having hatred for either parent, without taking this out on your mother? She obviously loved you very much, but wow, how have you coped with this discovery?
well, through Jesus, obviously. I mean, when I became saved on March 5th, 1972, that's when I first experienced love. Because I never really felt love growing up. I was never told I was loved. And I can remember being hugged once, and that was in 1974 when I went to a trip to Israel. And that was only because her aunt at the airport said, you better hug your son because you may not come back alive. Because back then, in those days, there was a lot of terrorist activity going on and stuff like that. And I guess I probably, with all my childhood experiences of being bullied and stuff like that in school and whatever, and the situation with parents, I should be someone who would make the Hulk look like Pee Wee Herman, but I'm not, because of what the Lord does in your life and how that God can actually be a father to you when you don't have one.
That is a profound statement. Yeah, you went through a time of wanting to prove that he served in World War II.
Yes.
How did you go about that process?
Well, when I found out how that after he passed away, he was just treated because he had no relatives, like a John Doe, and they just took him in a body bag and took him outside of town, literally dropped him in an empty grave and just covered him over. Kind of.
Let me stop you right there. How in the world do you find someone that is buried in a field in a pauper's grave? How do you go about making that connection and proving that it's the person?
What actually happened was that some clues through Ancestry.com led me to the town of Dallas, Texas, and that's when I kind of was able to find out where he lived in a apartment complex, and before his death, actually before he got cancer of the throat. And so I guess once he got so sick, he had to go to the hospital. And from what I understand, he never came back. Once I found the name of the hospital, I called them, and they told me that he had passed away in 1999, the hour and date. And they said, if you want to have your father and more information, you need to call the medical examiner. So I called that and talked to them, and that's when they told me how to get the death certificate, but they also explained what happened to him. And that's when I got really upset, I guess, to learn how he was treated. Whether he's a veteran or not, nobody deserves to just be put in a body bag and just thrown away and forgotten about,
But
no
particularly,
headstone or nothing.
right, and particularly, this is a father that you've searched for and someone who has served our country. It's an amazing story. We're going to be back with Rex Beach after these words. You're listening to Our Community.